Here's the thing you need to know before I tell you this story. The woman who whispered those words was the same woman who, 3 months earlier, had threatened to fire him if he didn't stop bringing his daughter to work. And what she said next changed everything, not just for him, but for a little girl who had stopped believing in happy endings. Stay until the end, because the moment she discovers the truth about why he really took this job will leave you speechless. Daniel Rivera wiped the grease from his hands onto the already stained rag tucked into his back pocket. The late autumn sun was setting behind the Chicago skyline, casting long shadows across the private garage of Montgomery Enterprises. At 34, he'd worked on hundreds of cars, but never one like this, a vintage 1967 Mustang, cherry red, worth more than he'd make in 5 years. And never for someone like her. Catherine Montgomery was everything Daniel wasn't. Old money, Harvard educated, CEO of a company her great-grandfather built from nothing. She wore designer suits that cost more than his monthly rent, and she had a reputation in the business world for being ruthless, cold, and untouchable. The employees called her the Ice Queen behind her back, and after his first week working as her personal mechanic, Daniel understood why. But Daniel had secrets of his own. Secrets that kept him up at night, that made him take this job even though the pay was barely enough to cover childcare and his cramped apartment in the South Side. Secrets that had everything to do with the 8-year-old girl who was currently sitting on an overturned bucket in the corner of the garage, doing her homework by the light of a single bulb. "Daddy, how much longer?" Sophia asked, pushing her dark curls out of her face. She had her mother's eyes, deep brown and searching, and every time Daniel looked at her, he felt both overwhelming love and crushing guilt. "Almost done, Mija," he said, forcing a smile. "Just need to finish adjusting the carburetor." What Daniel didn't tell Sophia was that he'd already finished the carburetor an hour ago. He was stalling, running diagnostics he didn't need to run, because the moment he finished this car, he'd have to face Catherine Montgomery and have a conversation he'd been dreading for weeks. A conversation about why he needed to take 3 days off next month. A conversation that would require him to reveal the truth about Sophia's mother, about the hospital bills that were piling up, about the real reason he'd answered her job posting 6 months ago. The sound of heels clicking against concrete made Daniel's heart stop. He knew that sound. It haunted his dreams in ways he refused to acknowledge. "Monsieur Rivera." Catherine's voice was crisp, professional, carrying that slight New England accent that spoke of boarding schools and summer homes in the Hamptons. "I wasn't expecting you to still be here." Daniel slid out from under the Mustang, and for a moment, he forgot how to breathe. Catherine stood in the doorway, but she wasn't wearing her usual armor of power suits and pearls. Instead, she was in jeans and a simple white blouse, her blonde hair loose around her shoulders instead of pulled back in its usual severe bun. She looked almost human. "The timing belt was giving me trouble," Daniel lied. "Wanted to make sure it was perfect before tomorrow." Catherine's blue eyes flicked to the corner of the garage, and Daniel saw her expression harden when she noticed Sophia. "I thought we discussed this, Mr. Rivera. This garage is not a daycare." "I know, and I apologize. Her after-school program ended early today, and I didn't have anyone else who could." "Excuses." Catherine cut him off, her tone sharp. "I don't pay you for excuses. If you're feeling the tension right now, drop a comment below. Let me know if you've ever had a boss who made you feel like you couldn't catch a break. And if you're new here, make sure to subscribe because what happens next in this story is going to shock you." Sophia stood up from her bucket, her small chin lifted in defiance. "My daddy works harder than anyone. He fixes cars all day and then helps me with homework and makes me dinner and reads me stories. He's the best daddy in the whole world, and you're mean." Daniel closed his eyes, waiting for the explosion. Catherine Montgomery had fired people for far less than a child calling her mean to her face. This was it. 6 months of walking on eggshells, and it was going to end because of an 8-year-old's honesty. But the explosion never came. When Daniel opened his eyes, Catherine was staring at Sophia with an expression he couldn't read. Something flickered across her face, something that looked almost like pain, before the mask slipped back into place. "You have your father's spirit," Catherine said quietly. Then, to Daniel's complete shock, she walked over to Sophia and knelt down to her level. "What are you working on?" "Fractions," Sophia muttered, still wary. "I hate fractions. I hated them too when I was your age." Catherine picked up Sophia's worksheet, studying it. "But my father taught me a trick." "Do you want to know what it is?" Daniel watched, frozen, as Catherine Montgomery, CEO of a billion-dollar company, spent the next 15 minutes teaching his daughter about fractions. She used a bag of M&Ms from her purse to demonstrate, and by the end, Sophia was giggling at the Ice Queen. When Catherine finally stood up, there was a smudge of chocolate on her white blouse, and she didn't seem to notice. Or maybe she didn't care. "Mr. Rivera, may I speak with you privately?" Daniel's stomach dropped. Here it comes, he thought. The firing. The end of everything. He followed Catherine out of the garage and into the cool evening air. The city hummed around them, distant traffic, and the occasional burst of laughter from the bar across the street. Catherine stood with her back to him for a long moment, and when she finally turned around, her eyes were glistening. "How long has it been just you and her?" The question caught Daniel off guard. "I'm sorry." "Sophia's mother. How long has she been gone?" Daniel's jaw tightened. 4 years. "Cancer. Sophia was 4 when she died." Catherine nodded slowly, something shifting in her expression. "My mother died when I was 7. Ovarian cancer. My father never remarried. He said no one could ever replace her, so why try?" Daniel didn't know what to say. In 6 months. This was the most personal thing Catherine had ever shared with him. "I'm not going to fire you for bringing your daughter to work." Catherine continued, "But I need to understand something. Why did you take this job? You're overqualified. I've seen your resume. You managed an entire automotive shop in Phoenix. You could be running your own business. Instead, you're working as a personal mechanic for someone who, by your own daughter's assessment, is mean." This was the moment Daniel had been dreading. The moment of truth that could change everything or destroy it entirely. "Because I needed the health insurance," he said finally. "The best health insurance I could find. And your company offers the best in the state." Catherine frowned. "Sophia seems healthy." "She is now." Daniel's voice cracked. "But 6 months ago, she was diagnosed with a heart condition. A rare defect that didn't show up until she was 8. She needs surgery. Specialized surgery that only 3 hospitals in the country can perform. Without insurance, it would cost more than I could make in a lifetime. With your company's insurance, it's covered." Catherine was silent for a long moment. "Why didn't you tell me this when you applied? Would you have hired me if I had? Would you have given the job to a single father with a sick kid who needed time off for doctor's appointments and surgeries and hospital stays? Or would you have found someone less complicated?" The question hung in the air between them. Catherine's expression was unreadable, and Daniel prepared himself for the worst. "The surgery," Catherine said finally. "When is it scheduled?" 3 weeks. That's what I was going to ask you about. I need 3 days off, maybe more if there are complications. If that's too much, I understand. I can find another 3 days. Catherine's voice was firm, but not unkind. Take a week. Take whatever time you need. And Mr. Rivera, the surgery will be at Northwestern with Dr. Elizabeth Thornton. She's the best pediatric cardiac surgeon in the world. Daniel blinked. How do you know about Dr. Thornton? But Catherine was already walking away, her heels clicking against the pavement. Finish the car tomorrow. And bring Sophia. I have more M&Ms in my office. What Daniel didn't know, what he wouldn't discover until months later, was that Catherine Montgomery had personally called Northwestern that night and arranged for Dr. Thornton to perform Sophia's surgery. She'd also set up an anonymous trust fund to cover any expenses the insurance didn't. And she'd spent the next 3 hours crying in her penthouse apartment, looking at old photographs of herself at 8 years old, standing beside her dying mother's hospital bed. But I'm getting ahead of myself, because the story of Daniel Rivera and Catherine Montgomery was far from over. In fact, it was just beginning. The weeks leading up to Sophia's surgery were the most complicated of Daniel's life. Catherine had transformed overnight from a distant, demanding boss into something he couldn't quite define. She started finding reasons to visit the garage, always with the pretense of checking on her cars, but somehow always ending up cross-legged on the floor with Sophia, helping with homework or playing cards or teaching her chess. "Your boss is weird," Sophia announced one evening after Catherine had left. Daniel laughed despite himself. "Why do you say that?" "She's mean to everyone else. I see how the other people look at her when she walks by. They're scared of her. But she's nice to us. She even laughed at my joke about the chicken crossing the road, and it wasn't even that funny." "Maybe she's not as mean as everyone thinks," Daniel said, surprising himself with the words. Sophia studied him with those two perceptive eyes. "Daddy, do you like her?" "She's my boss, Mija." "That's not what I asked." Daniel didn't have an answer for that. Or maybe he did, but he wasn't ready to admit it to himself, let alone to his 8-year-old daughter. The problem was, Daniel was starting to notice things about Catherine that had nothing to do with work. The way she tilted her head when she laughed, really laughed, not the polished chuckle she used in business meetings. The way her eyes lit up when Sophia showed her a drawing. The small scar on her wrist that she always kept covered. And the story behind it that Daniel found himself desperately wanting to know. If this story is tugging at your heartstrings right now, give it a like. It really helps the channel grow, and I promise, we're just getting to the best part. 3 days before Sophia's surgery, Daniel was working late again. Sophia was at home with their elderly neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, who had become like a surrogate grandmother. The garage was quiet, just the occasional clink of metal and the soft jazz playing from Daniel's old radio. He didn't hear Catherine approach until she was right beside him. "You're here late," she said. Daniel jumped, banging his head on the hood of the car he was working on. "You scared me? Sorry." She didn't sound sorry. She sounded amused. "I brought you this." She held out a coffee cup from the expensive cafe down the street, the one where a single latte cost more than Daniel's hourly wage. "You didn't have to do that." "I know. I wanted to." They stood in awkward silence for a moment, the coffee cup suspended between them like a peace offering. Daniel finally took it, their fingers brushing in the exchange. The touch sent electricity up his arm, and from the way Catherine's breath caught, he knew she felt it too. "Can I ask you something?" Catherine said, perching on the edge of a workbench. "Depends on what it is." "Why did you move here from Phoenix?" "The truth." Daniel set down his tools, leaning against the car. Sophia's mother was from Chicago. She always wanted to come back, to be near her family. After she died, her parents blamed me. They thought I should have noticed the symptoms sooner, pushed her to see a doctor earlier. Maybe they were right. Either way, they wanted nothing to do with Sophia or me. But Sophia started asking about her mom's hometown, where she grew up, where they met. So I packed up everything we had and drove 2,000 miles to give my daughter a connection to the mother she barely remembers. Catherine was quiet for a long moment. That's either the most romantic thing I've ever heard or the most insane. Probably both. Daniel smiled sadly. "That was Alina. She made me do crazy things. You loved her. More than I thought possible. And when she died, I thought that was it. I thought I'd used up my one shot at love, and I'd spend the rest of my life just going through the motions, being a good dad, working hard, but never really feeling anything again. And now?" The question was loaded, dangerous, and they both knew it. Daniel met Catherine's eyes, and what he saw there made his heart race. "Now I'm not so sure," he admitted. Catherine stood up abruptly, smoothing her blouse even though it didn't need smoothing. "I should go. Early meeting tomorrow." But she didn't go. She stood there, close enough that Daniel could smell her perfume, something expensive and subtle that had started invading his dreams. "Catherine," he said, and it was the first time he'd ever used her first name. "Don't." Her voice was barely a whisper. "If you say what I think you're about to say, everything changes. And I don't know if I'm ready for everything to change." Then I won't say it. Daniel stepped closer, close enough to see the flecks of gold in her blue eyes. But can I ask you something first? What? Why do you really come down here every night? It's not about the cars. You barely look at them anymore. Catherine's laugh was shaky, vulnerable in a way he'd never seen from her. Because for the first time in 15 years, I feel like myself when I'm here. Not Catherine Montgomery, not the Ice Queen, just Catherine. A woman who can sit on a garage floor and eat M&Ms with an 8-year-old and not worry about shareholders or board meetings or the company my family built. Is that strange? No, Daniel said softly. That's the sanest thing you've ever said to me. The air between them was electric. Daniel could see Catherine's pulse fluttering at her throat, could feel his own heart pounding so hard he was sure she could hear it. And then his phone rang, shattering the moment. It was Mrs. Patterson. Sophia had a fever and was asking for him. Daniel was out of the garage and in his car within 30 seconds, barely remembering to say goodbye to Catherine. When he arrived home, Sophia was curled up on the couch, looking smaller and more fragile than he'd ever seen her. "Daddy," she whispered, "I'm scared." "I know, Mija. But you don't have to be. I'm here. What if something goes wrong? What if the doctors can't fix my heart?" Daniel gathered her into his arms, holding her tight. "Then we'll figure it out together, because that's what we do. We're a team, remember? Rivera Squad," Sophia murmured, repeating their family motto, Rivera Squad, undefeated and unafraid. Sophia fell asleep in his arms, and Daniel sat there for hours, watching her breathe, praying to every god he'd ever heard of that his little girl would be okay. He didn't notice the Blacktown car that pulled up outside his apartment building, or the blonde woman who sat inside for 20 minutes, watching his window, wiping tears from her cheeks. The morning of Sophia's surgery dawned gray and cold. Daniel hadn't slept, couldn't sleep, could barely function beyond putting one foot in front of the other. Mrs. Patterson had offered to come with them, but Daniel had declined. This was something he needed to face with his daughter, just the two of them. Or so he thought. When they arrived at Northwestern Memorial Hospital, Daniel stopped dead in his tracks. Catherine Montgomery was sitting in the waiting room, 2 cups of coffee in her hands and dark circles under her eyes. "What are you doing here?" Catherine stood up, pressing one of the coffees into his hand. "Where else would I be?" "But the company. Your meeting. I canceled it." She said it like it was nothing, like canceling meetings wasn't something that made headlines in business journals. "Some things are more important." Sophia tugged on Daniel's sleeve. "Daddy, Miss Catherine is here." "I see that, Mija. Can she come back with us? I want to show her my brave face." Daniel looked at Catherine, who looked at Sophia, who was smiling despite the fear in her eyes. "Of course I'll come back," Catherine said, taking Sophia's hand. "I want to see this brave face. I bet it's the bravest face in this whole hospital." The next few hours were a blur. Doctors explaining procedures, nurses taking vitals, Sophia being wheeled away in a hospital gown that made her look impossibly small. Daniel stood at the door to the operating room and watched his daughter disappear, and for a moment he couldn't breathe. Then he felt a hand slip into his. Catherine's hand, warm and steady. "She's going to be okay?" Catherine said. "You don't know that?" "No, I don't. But I believe it. And right now, believing is all we have." They sat together in the waiting room for 6 hours. 6 hours of terrible coffee, outdated magazines, and a fear so profound Daniel thought it might swallow him whole. Catherine stayed the entire time. She didn't check her phone, didn't take calls, didn't do any of the things Daniel expected from a woman who ran a billion-dollar company. She just sat beside him, holding his hand, being present. At one point, Daniel broke down, not loud dramatic sobs, but quiet tears that streamed down his face despite his best efforts to stop them. Catherine didn't say anything. She just handed him tissues and moved closer, letting him lean into her shoulder. "I can't lose her," he whispered. "She's all I have." "That's not true anymore," Catherine said softly. "You have me." Daniel looked at her, really looked at her, and saw the truth in her eyes. This wasn't his boss. This wasn't the Ice Queen. This was a woman who had broken through every wall she'd built around herself, all for him and an 8-year-old girl who had called her mean. "Catherine, the surgery is finished." They both jumped as Dr. Thornton appeared in the doorway. She was smiling. "It went perfectly. Sophia is in recovery, and she's already asking for her daddy." Daniel didn't remember standing up. He didn't remember crossing the room. He just knew that suddenly he was being led through hospital corridors. And then there was Sophia, small and pale but alive, beautifully alive. And she was reaching for him with both arms. "Daddy, I was brave." "You were so brave, Mija. The bravest girl in the whole world." "Is Miss Catherine here?" Daniel stepped aside, and Catherine moved into the doorway. For a moment, she looked uncertain, out of place in her designer clothes amid the medical equipment and sterile walls. But Sophia's face lit up, and she reached out her other hand. "You came." "Of course I came." Catherine's voice was thick with emotion. "I wouldn't miss it. Will you stay with Daddy while I sleep? He gets sad when I'm not there to make him laugh." Catherine looked at Daniel, a question in her eyes. He nodded, unable to speak past the lump in his throat. "I'll stay," Catherine promised, "for as long as he'll let me. If you've made it this far, you're amazing. Please take a second to subscribe if you haven't already, because I pour my heart into these stories, and your support means the world." Now, let me tell you what happened next. Sophia's recovery was slow but steady. She spent a week in the hospital, and Catherine was there every day. She brought books, games, a laptop loaded with Sophia's favorite movies. She brought her work to the hospital so she could answer emails while Sophia napped. But the moment Sophia woke up, the laptop closed and Catherine was fully present. The hospital staff started whispering. The patients in neighboring rooms started whispering. Even Dr. Thornton raised an eyebrow when she saw the CEO of Montgomery Enterprises braiding an 8-year-old's hair. "Interesting choice of caretaker." Dr. Thornton commented to Daniel during one of Sophia's physical therapy sessions. "She's not what I expected," Daniel admitted. "Few people are, when you actually take the time to know them." Daniel thought about that a lot over the following weeks. As Sophia grew stronger and eventually came home, Catherine's presence didn't diminish. If anything, it grew. She started having dinner with them on weekends. She taught Sophia to play piano on the baby grand in her penthouse. She laughed at Daniel's terrible jokes and argued with him about cars and music and whether pineapple belonged on pizza. Absolutely not. Catherine insisted one Sunday evening, watching in horror as Daniel loaded a frozen pizza with pineapple chunks. "That's a crime against humanity." "It's a crime against boring taste buds," Daniel countered. "Live a little, Montgomery. I live plenty. I just live with dignity and proper pizza toppings." Sophia giggled from her spot at the kitchen table. "You two argue like my friend Emma's parents." The kitchen went silent. Daniel and Catherine looked at each other, then quickly looked away. "We're not arguing," Catherine said, her voice slightly higher than normal. "We're having a spirited debate." "Dad, what's a spirited debate?" "It's when adults argue but don't want to admit it," Daniel said, winking at his daughter. Catherine threw a pineapple chunk at him. It hit him squarely in the forehead, and Sophia burst into delighted laughter. Looking at them, golden in the lamplight of his tiny kitchen, Daniel felt something he hadn't felt in 4 years. Something that felt terrifyingly like a family. But of course, happiness in stories like this is always challenged. And the challenge came from an unexpected direction. It was 3 months after Sophia's surgery when everything nearly fell apart. Daniel arrived at work one morning to find a sleek black car in the garage that didn't belong there. Leaning against it was a man he'd never seen before, tall, silver-haired, dressed in a suit that probably cost more than Daniel's car. "You must be Mr. Rivera," the man said. His voice was smooth, cultured, and somehow threatening. "I've heard so much about you." "And you are?" "Jonathan Sterling, Catherine's fiancé." Daniel felt like he'd been punched in the stomach. "Fiancé? Well, technically ex-fiancé. We were engaged before she took over the company. She broke things off, said she needed to focus on the business. But we've recently reconnected, and I'm here to win her back." Jonathan smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. I thought you should know. Mechanic to man, that Catherine and I have history. Deep history. The kind that doesn't just disappear. Daniel's hands clenched at his sides, but he kept his voice steady. Does Catherine know you're here? She will soon. I'm taking her to dinner tonight. Our favorite restaurant, the one where I first proposed. Jonathan pushed off from the car, adjusting his cufflinks. I just wanted to introduce myself. Catherine speaks highly of you and your daughter. I wanted to see what all the fuss was about. He walked past Daniel, close enough that his shoulder brushed Daniel's arm. Word of advice. Know your place. Catherine Montgomery belongs in a certain world. Penthouse apartments and charity galas and summers in the Hamptons. Not this. He gestured vaguely at the garage, at Daniel, at everything that represented his life. After Jonathan left, Daniel stood frozen for a long time. His hands were shaking, and he hated himself for it. Jonathan Sterling was everything Daniel wasn't: wealthy, polished, from Catherine's world. If she wanted to go back to him, Daniel had no right to stop her. But when Catherine came down to the garage that afternoon, her face was flushed with anger. I'm so sorry, she said immediately. Jonathan had no right to come here, no right to say whatever he said to you. You knew. He texted me after. Bragged about putting you in your place. Catherine's jaw tightened. I told him if he ever came near you or Sophia again, I would make sure he never worked in this city again. Daniel blinked. You did? Daniel. Catherine stepped closer, taking his hands in hers. I need you to understand something. Jonathan is my past. A past I'm not proud of, honestly. I was engaged to him because my father thought it was a good business match, not because I loved him. I've never loved him. I'm not sure I ever really loved anyone, not properly until... She stopped, her cheeks coloring. Until what? Catherine took a deep breath. Until a stubborn mechanic with grease, stained hands and terrible taste in pizza started making me question everything I thought I knew about myself. Daniel's heart was racing. Catherine, that night in the garage, before Sophia got sick, you asked me why I really came down there every evening. I gave you an answer, but it wasn't the whole truth. What's the whole truth? Catherine looked up at him, her blue eyes vulnerable in a way he'd never seen. When she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. I think about you all night. I lie in my penthouse apartment, surrounded by everything money can buy, and I think about you. About your laugh, your hands. The way you look at Sophia like she's the most precious thing in the universe. I think about what it would be like to be looked at that way. To be someone's everything. Daniel couldn't breathe, couldn't think, could only stand there as Catherine Montgomery, the woman who had once threatened to fire him, the woman everyone called the Ice Queen, bared her soul in the middle of a garage. I'm terrified, she continued. I've never felt like this before, and I don't know what to do with it. I don't know how to be someone's partner, someone's mother. I don't know if I'd be any good at it. But I know that when I'm with you and Sophia, I feel like the person I was always meant to be. And I don't want to lose that. I don't want to lose you. Daniel cupped her face in his hands, heedless of the grease that smudged her perfect skin. You're not going to lose us, he said. We're not that easy to get rid of. And then he kissed her. Soft and sweet at first, then deeper, pouring 4 years of loneliness and fear and hope into that single moment. Catherine melted into him, her arms wrapping around his neck, and Daniel knew, with absolute certainty, that this was the beginning of something extraordinary. But they still had one more obstacle to face. Jonathan Sterling didn't give up easily. Over the following weeks, he launched a campaign to win Catherine back, showing up at her office with flowers, calling board members to whisper about the inappropriateness of the CEO dating an employee, leaking stories to the gossip pages about Catherine Montgomery slumming it with the help. The board grew concerned. Catherine's reputation was being questioned, and Daniel started to wonder if he was ruining her life. Maybe we should cool things off, he said one evening. Just until this blows over. Catherine looked at him like he'd suggested she set herself on fire. Absolutely not. But the board can fire me if they want. This company has been my whole life for 15 years, and I'm good at my job, but it doesn't define me. Not anymore. She took his hand. You and Sophia define me. Being with you makes me better. Makes me braver. And I'm not going to give that up, because some bitter ex-fiancé can't accept that I've moved on. Daniel smiled despite himself. You know, for an ice queen, you're pretty warm. Call me that again and I'll put you on carburetor duty for a month. Yes, Mom. The final confrontation came at the company's annual charity gala. Catherine had insisted on bringing Daniel as her date, despite the whispers she knew would follow. She'd bought him a new suit, had argued with him for an hour about whether he really needed to wear it, and ultimately won by reminding him that Sophia wanted to see pictures. That's cheating, Daniel had grumbled. That's strategy, Catherine had countered. The gala was everything Daniel had feared: crystal chandeliers, champagne that cost more per glass than his weekly grocery bill, and hundreds of Chicago's elites staring at him like he'd wandered in from the street. But Catherine never left his side. She introduced him as her partner, not her employee. She laughed at his jokes, leaned into him when they stood together, and generally acted like she was the luckiest woman in the room. Which is when Jonathan Sterling made his move. He appeared on stage during the silent auction, microphone in hand, and Daniel knew immediately that something was wrong. Catherine's hand tightened on his arm. Ladies and gentlemen, I have a special announcement. Many of you know me as a longtime supporter of this charity and a close friend of the Montgomery family. What you may not know is that Catherine and I were once engaged, and I've recently come to realize that letting her go was the biggest mistake of my life. The crowd murmured. Catherine went pale. So tonight, in front of everyone who matters, I'm going to do what I should have done years ago. I'm going to fight for the woman I love. He pulled a ring box from his pocket, and the crowd gasped. Catherine Montgomery, I know you're seeing someone else. Someone. Beneath you, if I'm being honest. But I also know that deep down, you know where you belong. So I'm asking you, in front of everyone, will you give us another chance? Will you marry me? The room was silent. Every eye was on Catherine, and Catherine started to laugh. It wasn't a polite, social laugh. It was a full-bodied, genuine laugh that echoed off the crystal chandeliers and made Jonathan Sterling's smug expression falter. Jonathan, she said, her voice carrying across the silent room, I'm going to say this once, very clearly, so there's no room for misunderstanding. No. The answer is no. It was no 5 years ago when I broke off our engagement. It's no now, and it will be no forever. She stepped forward, and her voice grew stronger. You think Daniel is beneath me because he works with his hands. Because he didn't go to Harvard or inherit a fortune. Let me tell you something about the man I love. He drives a 15-year-old car because he puts every extra dollar toward his daughter's future. He stayed up for 36 hours straight when she was in the hospital because he couldn't bear to miss a moment if something went wrong. He makes the worst pizza I've ever tasted and tells the corniest jokes, and he has never, not once, made me feel like I had to be anyone other than myself. She turned to Daniel, her eyes shining. That's what love is, Jonathan. It's not about money or status or what looks good on paper. It's about finding someone who sees you, really sees you, and loves you anyway. Daniel Rivera sees me, and I see him, and I wouldn't trade that for all the penthouse apartments and charity galas in the world. The room erupted in applause. Daniel stood frozen, overwhelmed, as Catherine walked toward him with the brightest smile he'd ever seen. I love you, she said, loud enough for everyone to hear. I love you too, he managed. Even though you hate pineapple on pizza. Catherine laughed again, then kissed him right there in the middle of the gala, in front of all of Chicago's elite, and Daniel didn't care about any of them. He only cared about the woman in his arms and the little girl waiting at home. Jonathan Sterling slunk off the stage in disgrace. He left Chicago a week later, and no one particularly missed him. The following year was the happiest of Daniel's life. Sophia thrived, her heart stronger than ever, her laughter filling the apartment they'd moved into together, all three of them. Catherine stepped down as CEO, promoting her incredibly capable CFO and taking a consulting role that let her work from home and spend afternoons teaching Sophia to cook disastrous meals and playing catch in the park. On the anniversary of Sophia's surgery, Daniel took Catherine back to the garage where they'd first really talked. He'd cleaned it up, strung fairy lights along the ceiling, and put a portable speaker in the corner playing the soft jazz that always reminded him of late nights and slowly falling in love. "What is this?" Catherine asked, looking around with wide eyes. Daniel got down on one knee. "Catherine Montgomery, you walked into my life when I wasn't looking for anyone. You saw me at my lowest and my most afraid, and instead of walking away, you stayed. You loved my daughter like she was your own. You showed me that it's possible to find love again, even when you think your heart has nothing left to give." He pulled out a ring. It wasn't a diamond. It was a small, perfect ruby set in a simple gold band. "This was my mother's ring. She gave it to me before she passed and told me to give it to someone who made me believe in miracles again. You are that miracle, Catherine. You and Sophia and this life we've built together. So I'm asking you, will you marry me? Will you let me spend the rest of my life showing you how much you're loved?" Catherine was crying. Daniel was crying. Somewhere in the shadows, Sophia was definitely crying because she'd insisted on hiding in the corner to watch. "Yes," Catherine whispered. "1,000 times yes." And as Daniel slipped the ring onto her finger and pulled her into his arms, he knew that this was the ending he'd stopped believing was possible. But it wasn't an ending. Not really. It was a beginning. This story was inspired by something real. A few years ago, I met a mechanic at a shop near my house who was raising his daughter alone. He worked 14-hour days and still found time to coach her soccer team. When I asked him how he did it, he smiled and said, "Love makes the impossible possible." I never forgot that. Whatever you're going through right now, whatever obstacle seems too big to overcome, I hope Daniel and Catherine's story reminds you that life can surprise you, that people can surprise you, that the person you're meant to be with might be standing in front of you right now, just waiting for you to see them. Now I want to hear from you. Drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from. Are you from the United States, Brazil, the Philippines, Germany? Let me know, because this community is global, and I love knowing that these stories are reaching people all over the world. If this story touched your heart, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who needs to hear that love is still possible. Your support means everything. Until next time, remember, the best love stories don't start with perfection. They start with two imperfect people who refuse to give up on each other. See you in the next one.